Atlas was not waiting for the sunrise. He was waiting for someone Caleb Rowe could not see. The seventh morning began in the same strange silence as the six before it, long before Briar Falls opened its eyes, before porch lights blinked on across the county road, before the bakery downtown warmed its ovens, and the first pickup rolled past the feed store. Caleb woke to the soft scrape of claws near the back door. Not frantic, not loud, just steady, patient, the kind of sound a promise makes when it refuses to die. He found Atlas standing in the kitchen, dark sable and tan coat silvered by the moonlight coming through the window, amber eyes fixed on him with a seriousness that made the room feel colder than it was. Caleb pulled on jeans, a thermal shirt, and his old field jacket without asking why. He already knew where the German Shepherd would lead him. Willow Lake waited half a mile beyond the last houses of Briar Falls, tucked behind cottonwoods and bare winter brush, its surface hidden beneath a low white veil of fog. The air was 31 degrees, sharp enough to turn Caleb's breath pale. Frost stiffened the grass along the trail. Somewhere in the dark, a mourning dove called once, then went quiet. Atlas moved ahead with purpose, not chasing scent, not wandering, not acting like a dog out for a morning walk. He walked like he had an appointment. Caleb followed with his hands in his jacket pockets and unease pressing under his ribs. For 6 mornings, Atlas had left the house before dawn and gone to the same place on the eastern bank. For 6 mornings, he had stood by the old wooden dock, staring across the water as if someone was late. Caleb had told himself it was deer scent, a raccoon trail, some sound moving through the reeds. Anything ordinary. But ordinary things did not make Atlas ignore food, warmth, and Caleb's voice. Ordinary things did not make a trained K9 hold position with that much grief in his stillness. They reached the lake just as the sky began to loosen from black to deep blue. The dock stretched out into the fog, weathered boards slick with dew, iron nails dark against the wood. Atlas stopped at the first plank. His ears lifted. His body became completely still. Caleb stood behind him, watching the fog move over the water in slow ribbons. "What are you waiting for?" he whispered. Atlas did not turn. His gaze stayed locked on the empty dock, on the gray lake beyond it, on some point where memory and morning seemed to meet. Caleb felt the old ache stir before he knew its name. Willow Lake had once been his favorite place in the world. Before the Corps, before the years away, before the friend he had promised to bring here never got the chance to stand on this dock beside him. Mason Reed had called it their future fishing spot, though he had only ever seen it in a photo Caleb carried folded behind his driver's license. Caleb had laughed then and said the base were not worth crossing state lines for. Mason had grinned and answered that some places were not about the fish. Now Atlas stepped onto the dock and lowered his nose to a faded red fishing bobber caught between 2 boards near the edge. Caleb's breath caught. The bobber was old, chipped, and weathered by water, but 3 tiny stars were marked on one side in black ink. Caleb knew those stars. Mason used to draw them on everything he wanted someone to remember. Caleb stood frozen over the old red bobber, the cold seeping through his boots and climbing slowly into his bones. The 3 stars were small, almost careless, drawn by a hand that had never treated memory like something formal. Mason Reed had marked coffee cups that way. Ammo cans. Letters home. The inside flap of a cardboard box one December when everyone was tired and pretending not to be. 3 stars meant save this. 3 stars meant do not forget. 3 stars meant somebody is still holding a place for you. Atlas lowered his head and touched the bobber with his nose, then looked toward the line of reeds beyond the dock. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. At first, he saw only fog, dead grass, and the dark wet shapes of stones along the bank. Then Atlas stepped off the dock, moved down the narrow, muddy edge of the lake, and stopped beside a clump of winter-bent cattails. He did not dig. He did not bark. He simply stood there and waited with his tail low, as if the earth itself needed permission to speak. Caleb crouched beside him and pushed the reeds aside. Under a layer of damp leaves rested a small metal tackle box wrapped in a faded waterproof bag. It was the kind sold at hardware stores for less than $20, the kind a man might buy for hooks and line and nothing more. But this one had been tied carefully with old cord, and on the lid, scratched into the green paint, were the same 3 stars. Caleb sat back on his heels. His breath came out thin and uneven. No, he whispered, not because he did not believe it, but because belief would hurt. Atlas sat beside him, shoulder touching Caleb's arm. The contact was warm, steady, and patient. Caleb loosened the cord with stiff fingers. The bag cracked softly from age and cold. Inside, the tackle box was dry. The latch resisted for a moment, then opened with a small metallic click that sounded too loud in the fog. Caleb lifted the lid. There was no treasure inside, not the kind people mean when they say treasure. No money, no metal, no bright dramatic thing. Just a few quiet objects arranged with care. A folded photograph sealed in plastic. A red and white fishing bobber newer than the one caught in the dock. A single and used lure with a silver spoon that flashed faintly in the dim morning. And a letter, folded twice, with Caleb Rowe written across the front in Mason's uneven block handwriting. Caleb did not touch the letter first. He picked up the photograph. In it, Caleb stood beside Mason and Atlas near a makeshift Christmas tree made from field gear and string lights powered by a small battery pack. Caleb looked younger, leaner, sun-browned, and almost smiling. Mason had his arm thrown around him, grinning like the world had not yet taught either of them how costly promises could become. Atlas sat between them, younger too, ears high, eyes fixed on Caleb instead of the camera. The sight pressed against Caleb's chest until he had to lower the picture to breathe. Willow Lake stayed silent around him. The fog thinned by inches. Across the water, a pale line of silver began to touch the horizon. Caleb finally lifted the letter. The paper felt dry, protected all these years by plastic and patience. His name on the front looked like it had been waiting for his hand specifically, not just any hand. Atlas leaned closer, his muzzle near Caleb's wrist, not pushing, only reminding. Caleb unfolded the first page. Mason's words were plain, just as his voice had been. If Atlas brought you here, then you waited too long, brother. Caleb shut his eyes. The lake, the reeds, the cold dock, the dog beside him, all of it blurred into one ache. He had thought Atlas was waiting for Mason, but the letter already knew the truth. Atlas had been waiting for Caleb. Caleb kept the letter open in both hands, but for a long moment, he could not read past the first line. If Atlas brought you here, then you waited too long, brother. The words did not accuse him. That was what made them harder to bear. Mason had never needed cruelty to tell the truth. He could say a thing gently and still make it land in the center of a man's chest. Atlas settled beside Caleb on the cold bank, his dark sable coat damp with fog, his shoulder pressed against Caleb's sleeve. The lake was beginning to wake now. A thin pale glow spread behind the tree line. The fog lifted in slow folds, revealing the old dock, the gray water, the far shore where bare branches leaned over their own reflections. Caleb drew one careful breath and kept reading. Mason wrote that if this box ever reached Caleb, it meant at least one of them had made it home to Briar Falls, and that had to count for something. He wrote about the picture Caleb used to carry behind his driver's license, the one of Willow Lake at sunrise, water shining like poured silver, and a wooden dock stretching into the morning. Mason said he had stared at that photo during long nights far from home until he almost knew the place by heart. He said Caleb had made it sound like a place where noise went to rest. Then Mason wrote the sentence Caleb had avoided for years. You promised me a fishing morning there, and I intend to collect, even if you have to bring me in your pocket and let the dog supervise. Caleb laughed once, but it came out broken and soft. Atlas turned his head toward him, ears shifting. He would say that, Caleb whispered. His voice carried over the water and disappeared into the reeds. He kept reading. Mason had written about the red bobber, about the lure, about the 3 stars. He said the stars were not decoration. They were a reminder. One for the one who leaves. One for the one who stays. One for the one who keeps watch between them. Caleb lowered the page and looked at Atlas. The shepherd's amber eyes held the dim dawn, calm and certain, as if he had carried that 3rd star all along without knowing its name. Caleb read the last section slowly. If you came back alone, do not spend your life standing outside every place we meant to go. Go there. Sit down. Say my name if you can. Say nothing if you cannot. But do not make loyalty into a locked door. Atlas will wait as long as he has to. Do not make him wait forever. The paper trembled in Caleb's hands. Around him, morning widened. A pair of ducks moved across the lake, leaving 2 clean lines behind them. Far off, a dog barked once from a farmhouse. and the sound reached them thin and familiar. Caleb folded the letter halfway, then stopped. He looked at the old dock, at the red bobber caught between the boards, at the tackle box opened beside his knee. He remembered himself at 20, sitting on that dock with his father, pretending to know more about fishing than he did. He remembered telling Mason about the lake because homesickness had made him careless one night. He remembered promising the trip with the easy confidence of men who believed time would wait for them. But time had not waited. It had moved on without asking permission, and Caleb, unable to follow it, had stayed away from the water like the lake itself had broken the promise. Atlas rose and stepped onto the dock again. He walked halfway out, then looked back. Not commanding, inviting. Caleb stood slowly, knees stiff, fingers still holding Mason's letter. The boards creaked beneath his boots as he followed. At the edge of the dock, Atlas sat facing the sunrise. Caleb sat beside him, lowering himself carefully onto the damp wood. The cold came through his jeans at once, sharp and real. He placed the photo, the letter, and the new bobber beside him. The first gold line of sun touched the far water. Caleb swallowed hard. "Morning, Mason," he said. 2 words. Almost nothing. But the lake received them, and for the first time in years, Caleb did not take them back. Caleb stayed on the dock until the sun rose high enough to turn the fog into gold. He did not say much after Mason's name. He did not need to. The 2 words had opened something, and the silence that followed was not empty anymore. It had room in it. Room for the creak of old boards under his weight. Room for the soft lap of Willow Lake against the pilings. Room for Atlas breathing beside him, steady and warm, his damp coat touching Caleb's sleeve each time the dog shifted. Caleb picked up the new red and white bobber from the tackle box and rolled it between his fingers. It was clean and used and strangely bright against the weathered gray wood. Mason had meant for this moment to happen years ago, maybe on some ordinary summer morning with coffee in a thermos and bad jokes echoing across the water. Instead, it had come in winter, with frost on the reeds and a grown man trying to remember how to keep a promise without breaking apart under it. Atlas leaned forward and sniffed the bobber, then looked at Caleb as if asking what came next. Caleb almost smiled. "I guess we need a pole," he said. His voice sounded rough, but alive. They gathered the photograph, the letter, the lure, and the tackle box. Caleb slipped Mason's letter inside his jacket, close enough that he could feel the folded paper against his chest when he breathed. The walk home felt shorter than the walkout had been. Briar Falls was waking now, the quiet kind of American morning made of porch smoke, distant engines, and sunlight sliding over frosted roofs. A school bus rolled slowly past the end of Maple Road, its yellow sides glowing in the early light. Mrs. Bell was already sweeping her front steps in a heavy sweater, though there was hardly anything there to sweep. She lifted a hand when she saw Caleb and Atlas coming up from the lake trail. Caleb lifted his back. It was a small thing, but it felt like stepping over a line he had drawn years ago and forgotten how to cross. At the house, Atlas paused by the porch, expecting the day to fold back into its usual shape. But Caleb did not go inside right away. He turned toward the shed behind the garage, the one he had avoided for too long because it smelled of old wood, motor oil, and his father's fishing gear. The door stuck from cold. Caleb shouldered it open and let the pale morning light fall across the clutter inside. There, hanging above a workbench, was the old fishing rod his father had given him when he was 12. The cork handle was darkened by years of use. The reel needed oil. The line was brittle and would have to be replaced. But it was still there, waiting in its own quiet way. Caleb reached up and took it down. Dust lifted in the beam of light. Atlas sat at the doorway, watching with the same solemn patience he had shown at the lake. Caleb ran his thumb along the rod, and another memory rose, gentler than the others. His father teaching him how to tie a knot, telling him not to rush because fish could feel impatience through the line. Caleb let out a slow breath. "We are not catching anything with this yet," he said to Atlas. "But we can start." He spent the next hour at the kitchen table cleaning the reel, replacing the old line with a spool from a drawer, and tying on Mason's silver lure with hands that grew steadier as they worked. Atlas lay under the table, chin on his paws, never far. When Caleb clipped the red and white bobber above the lure, the 3 stars on the tackle box seemed to catch the morning light from across the room. By then, the sun had fully risen. The first urgent mystery was gone, but something deeper had begun. Caleb looked at the finished rod, then at Atlas. "All right," he said softly. "Let us take him fishing." They returned to Willow Lake just before noon, when the winter sun sat pale above the cottonwoods and the fog had finally lifted from the water. The lake looked different in daylight. Less haunted, more honest. The dock still sagged at the edges, the reeds still bowed under frost, and the old bobber still rested where Caleb had left it between the boards, but the place no longer felt like a door he was afraid to open. It felt like a room he had finally stepped into. Caleb carried his father's fishing rod in one hand and Mason's tackle box in the other. Atlas walked beside him, close but calm, his dark sable coat catching bits of sunlight, his amber eyes moving from Caleb to the lake and back again. At the end of the dock, Caleb set the tackle box down and opened it. The photograph was safe inside a plastic sleeve. The letter rested folded beneath it. The unused lure was gone now, tied to the line. The red and white bobber floated above it, bright against the gray water when Caleb cast gently from the dock. The line made a soft whisper through the guides, and the lure touched the lake with a small, clean sound. Caleb watched the ripples spread outward. No thunder rolled. No sign split the clouds. The world did not pause to announce that a promise had been kept. A crow called from a bare branch. A truck passed somewhere beyond the tree line. Atlas sat beside Caleb's boots and looked out across the water as if this quiet was ceremony enough. Caleb lowered himself onto the dock, careful with the rod across his knees. He would have complained about the cold, he said. Atlas flicked one ear. Then he would have acted like it was his idea. The smallest smile moved across Caleb's face. It did not erase the ache. It did not try to. For the first time, the ache had somewhere to sit beside his chest. It could sit on the dock. It could move with the ripples. It could share space with sunlight, with breath, with a loyal dog keeping close watch over a man learning how to stay. Caleb reached into his jacket and touched Mason's letter through the fabric. "You made it," he said, not loudly, not to the sky, not even fully to the lake, just into the morning. Atlas leaned against his leg, warm and solid. The bobber drifted slowly, tugged by a faint current. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Caleb did not mind. He had forgotten that fishing was mostly waiting without resentment, waiting while light changed, waiting while cold softened, waiting while the heart learned that stillness was not the same as being stuck. When the bobber dipped once, Caleb reacted too late, and whatever had touched the lure slipped away. He laughed under his breath. "You see that? Still terrible at this." Atlas looked up at him, mouth slightly open, almost smiling in the way dogs do when they forgive everything before it is asked. Caleb reeled in, checked the lure, and cast again. This time, he did not cast for Mason exactly. He cast with him. That was different. By the time they headed home, the sun had warmed the frost into silver drops along the reeds. Caleb left the old weathered bobber on the dock rail, 3 stars facing the water, not as a marker of grief, but as a small sign that someone had been remembered there with love. Atlas paused beside it, sniffed once, then followed Caleb down the path without looking back. That evening, Caleb placed Mason's tackle box on the small shelf in the hallway, beside the framed photograph of him, Mason, and Atlas from years earlier. He did not hide it in the garage. He did not tuck the letter into a drawer where grief could gather dust around it. He set it where morning light would touch the 3 scratched stars on the lid. Atlas stood beside him while he did it, his amber eyes following every movement with the solemn care of a witness. The house smelled faintly of lake water now, mixed with coffee, old wood, and the clean winter air that had followed them through the door. Caleb made a simple dinner, fed Atlas, and sat at the kitchen table longer than usual, not because he had nowhere to go, but because for once he did not feel chased from the room by silence. Outside, the sky darkened over Briar Falls. Porch lights came on one by one. Somewhere down the road, a neighbor started a truck, and the low engine sound moved through the night without pulling Caleb toward the keys. He looked at Atlas lying near the doorway, paws crossed, head resting low but eyes open. "You were not waiting for him to come back," Caleb said softly. The dog's ears shifted. Caleb leaned back in the chair, the truth arriving not like a blow, but like a hand settling over his shoulder. "You were waiting for me to go back." Atlas gave one slow blink. That was answer enough. Later, Caleb took Mason's letter from the shelf and read it again under the kitchen light. The words were the same, but the ache around them had changed. It no longer felt like a locked room. It felt like a road sign. Go there. Sit down. Say my name if you can. Say nothing if you cannot. Caleb touched the paper once, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the box. Before bed, he opened the back door for Atlas out of habit. Cold air slipped in, carrying the smell of frost and pine. The shepherd stepped onto the porch, looked toward the dark trail that led to Willow Lake, then looked back at Caleb. For 6 mornings, he had left before dawn like a dog with unfinished business. Tonight, he did not move from the porch. Caleb understood. Not alone, he said. Atlas turned and came back inside. The door closed with a soft click that felt almost like a blessing. In the days that followed, the change was quiet enough that most of Briar Falls would never have noticed it. Caleb still fixed things for neighbors. He still drank coffee too strong. He still wore the old field jacket with the frayed cuff. But each morning, before work, he and Atlas walked to Willow Lake together. No urgency. No mystery now. Just the soft rhythm of boots and paws on the trail, the winter air opening their lungs, the dock waiting in the early light. Caleb did not always bring the fishing rod. Some mornings, he only stood at the rail and watched the water brighten. Some mornings, he spoke one sentence to Mason. Some mornings, none. Atlas never demanded more. He lay beside Caleb's boots, content now that the waiting had become shared. One Friday, Mrs. Bell saw them returning from the lake and called from her porch, "Fish biting?" Caleb glanced down at Atlas, then back at her. For the first time in a long while, his smile came easily. "Not yet," he said, "but we are learning how to wait." Mrs. Bell nodded like she understood exactly what kind of fishing he meant. On the 10th morning, Caleb woke before Atlas. That had not happened in years. The house was still dark, the windows pale with frost, the hallway quiet except for the old clock ticking beside Mason's tackle box on the shelf. Caleb lay there for a moment, listening to the deep, even breathing of the German shepherd asleep near his bed. No scraping at the door. No urgent stare from the kitchen. No silent demand to follow. Just rest. The realization moved through Caleb gently. Atlas was sleeping because the promise no longer had to pull him out into the cold alone. Caleb dressed carefully, pulling on wool socks, jeans, his thermal shirt, and the old field jacket. When he picked up the fishing rod from the corner, Atlas opened one eye, then both. His ears lifted, but he did not leap up with urgency. Caleb smiled. "You coming, partner?" Atlas rose slowly, stretched, and came to his side with a calm dignity that made Caleb think of old soldiers at memorial parades, not marching because they had to, but because some things deserve to be honored upright. They walked to Willow Lake under a sky just beginning to lighten. The trail had become familiar in a new way. Not haunted, not forbidden, just theirs. Frost shone on the grass. Their breath drifted white between the bare branches. Somewhere across the fields, a rooster called too early, and a porch light blinked on at the Miller place. When they reached the dock, Caleb noticed something waiting near the old bobber he had left on the rail. A small thermos, 2 paper cups, and a folded note weighted down by a smooth lake stone. Atlas sniffed the note, then sat back, looking toward the road as if already knowing the answer. Caleb picked it up. The handwriting belonged to Mrs. Bell. Figured fishermen need coffee, especially the ones who are learning how to wait. Caleb laughed softly, the sound floating across the cold water. He poured coffee into 1 cup and held the warmth between his hands. The second cup he set carefully on the dock rail beside Mason's bobber. Not because Mason could drink it, because love sometimes needed a place to sit. Caleb cast the line, and the red and white bobber landed with a small splash. Atlas settled beside his boots, front paws crossed, eyes half closed against the first light. They stayed that way as the sun rose, gold moving across the lake inch by inch. After a while, the bobber dipped. Caleb lifted the rod too fast and missed the fish again. He looked down at Atlas, expecting silent judgment. The shepherd gave a soft huff, almost like a sigh. Caleb chuckled. "All right, I deserve that." The morning warmed slowly. A few birds moved through the reeds. The second cast went farther, cleaner. Caleb held the rod with both hands and felt the line hum faintly through the cork handle. There was no great catch that morning. No photograph-worthy base. No story anyone at the diner would repeat. But something better happened. Caleb stayed. He stayed through the cold, through the waiting, through the quiet places where grief used to speak louder than anything else. He stayed until the coffee cooled and the sun touched Atlas's dark coat with amber light. Before leaving, Caleb stood and looked across Willow Lake. "We will come back tomorrow," he said. Atlas rose at the word tomorrow, tail moving once, calm and certain. That was the miracle Caleb had not expected. Not that the past had returned. Not that pain had disappeared. But that tomorrow had become a word he could say without fear. By the end of that week, Willow Lake had become part of Caleb's mornings the way coffee and boots and Atlas's quiet presence had always been. He did not go there to prove anything. He did not go because grief demanded tribute. He went because the place no longer felt like a wound he had to walk around. It felt like a bench left open in the sun. On Saturday, the air warmed just enough for the frost to melt before noon, and Briar Falls took on the sleepy brightness of a small town between seasons. Caleb spent the afternoon in the shed, sanding a narrow piece of cedar he had found behind a stack of old paint cans. Atlas lay in the doorway, nose on his paws, watching sawdust gather in pale curls at Caleb's boots. Caleb worked slowly, not as a craftsman making something perfect, but as a man learning that care mattered more than polish. He carved 3 small stars into the top corner, then burned the words Mason's Place beneath them with an old wood pen his father had left behind. The letters came out uneven. One star leaned a little. Caleb almost started over. Then he heard Mason's voice in memory, easy and amused, saying anything too perfect probably had not lived enough. Caleb kept it. Near sunset, he wrapped the cedar marker in a towel, picked up the fishing rod, and nodded to Atlas. "Let us finish it right." They walked to the lake under a sky turning peach and blue, the kind of evening that made every bare branch look drawn by a careful hand. Mrs. Bell was on her porch when they passed. She did not ask where they were going. She only lifted one hand, and in the other held her coffee mug like a small salute. Caleb lifted the rod in answer. At Willow Lake, the water lay calm, reflecting the first silver hint of evening. The old dock creaked when Caleb stepped onto it, familiar now, almost welcoming. Atlas went straight to the rail where the weathered red bobber sat with its 3 faded stars facing the lake. Caleb knelt beside it and placed the cedar marker against the post at the end of the dock, securing it with 2 small screws he had carried in his pocket. The sound of the screwdriver turning was quiet, ordinary, and somehow holy. When it was done, Caleb sat back on his heels. Mason's Place. 3 stars. A dock. A lake. A dog standing guard beside him. Nothing more. Nothing less. Atlas sniffed the marker, then touched his nose to the old bobber. Caleb ran a hand over the shepherd's back. "Think he would approve?" Atlas looked out over the water, ears relaxed, face calm. Caleb took that as yes. He cast the line once, watching the red and white bobber land beyond the dock in the soft evening light. It drifted there, small and bright, while the lake darkened around it. For a long time, Caleb said nothing. Then he spoke as if Mason were sitting beside him with cold coffee and a bad joke ready. He told him about Mrs. Bell's thermos, about missing 2 bites in a row, about Atlas sleeping later now, about how the mornings had become easier, not because the past had changed, but because Caleb had stopped asking it to stay buried. The words came slowly at first, then more naturally, like a creek thawing under spring sun. Atlas settled against his boots, his body warm in the cooling air. When the first star appeared above the tree line, Caleb reeled in and packed the rod. Before leaving, he touched the cedar marker once. "See you tomorrow," he said. This time, he did not feel foolish saying it. On the walk home, Atlas did not look back toward the lake. Neither did Caleb. They carried it with them now. The next morning, Atlas did not wake Caleb before dawn. Caleb woke on his own to a pale blue light resting against the bedroom wall and the quiet sound of the German shepherd breathing near the foot of the bed. For a moment, he stayed still, listening. No urgent claws at the door. No restless pacing in the hall. No silent command pulling them toward the lake. Just peace. Atlas opened his eyes when Caleb sat up, but he did not rise until Caleb smiled and reached for his old field jacket. "Ready?" Caleb asked. The dog stood, stretched slowly, and came to him with his tail moving low and easy. Outside, Briar Falls was just beginning to stir. The air was cold, but not sharp. A thin mist lay over the fields, and the sky above Willow Lake carried the first soft color of morning. They walked without hurry, boots and paws finding the trail together. When they reached the dock, The cedar marker waited at the end post, simple and uneven and true. Mason's place. The old red bobber rested on the rail below it. 3 faded stars turned toward the water. Caleb stood there a moment, one hand on Atlas's head, and felt the strange mercy of being able to miss someone without losing himself. He set down the tackle box, cast the line once, and watched the bobber land in the quiet lake. Then he sat on the dock. Atlas lowered himself beside Caleb's boots with a long, contented sigh. The sun came slowly, turning the water from gray to silver to gold. Caleb did not speak right away. He let the morning arrive fully. A duck moved through the reeds. A fish touched the surface far out and vanished. Somewhere behind them, the town began its ordinary day of screen doors, coffee, engines, and porch greetings. Finally, Caleb looked over the lake and said, "Morning, Mason." The words came easily now. Not painless. Easy. There was a difference. Atlas rested his chin across Caleb's boot, amber eyes half closed in the light. Caleb reached down and stroked the thick fur between his ears. "You were waiting for me," he said softly. "All this time." Atlas gave one small breath, as if the answer had always been obvious. Caleb looked back at the water. For so long, he had thought home was a place people returned to whole. Now he understood it differently. Home was where love kept a place for the broken parts until they were ready to sit down. Home was an old dock, a loyal dog, a crooked cedar sign, a friend's name spoken into morning air, and the courage to come back tomorrow. The bobber drifted gently, bright against the widening gold. Caleb did not care whether anything bit. He had already received what the lake had been holding. When they finally rose to leave, Atlas did not linger at the rail. He walked beside Caleb down the trail, calm and light, no longer guarding an unfinished promise alone. Behind them, Willow Lake shone under the full sunrise. Ahead, Briar Falls waited warm and waking. Caleb looked down at the dog who had brought him back, then toward the road home. Some returns do not make a sound. They arrive in steady footsteps, in breath turning white above cold grass, in a faithful heart that refuses to give up its post until the lost are ready to be found.